There is a story so old it has no author. It was never written by a single hand sitting down at a desk with intent. It was breathed into existence across centuries, passed mouth to mouth, campfire to campfire, generation to generation, in a land so flat and so ancient that the horizon itself felt like a warning. And then one day, someone scraped it into wet clay, and it survived. Think about that for a moment. Think about the sheer, improbable weight of that. Thousands of years of human civilization have come and gone. Entire empires have risen and been swallowed whole by the sand. Languages spoken by millions have died without a single living speaker left to mourn them. And yet this story, this particular terrifying little story about a tower, refused to die. That alone should make you feel something. Because stories don't survive for thousands of years by accident. They survive because they are touching something true about what it means to be human. They survive because they are articulating a fear so deep, so primal, so structurally embedded in the wiring of the human mind that each new generation encounters it and recognizes it immediately, the way you recognize a face you've never seen but somehow already know. So let's go back. Not to the manicured Sunday school version of this story, not to the flannel board illustration with cartoon workers and a pastel sky. Let's go back to the raw material. Let's go back to the actual text. Because the actual text is stranger and more disturbing than most people realize. Open Genesis chapter 11, verse 1. The King James Version reads like this: "And the whole earth was of one language and of one speech." That's the opening sentence. One language, one speech. Now, in the original Hebrew, the word for language here is safa, which literally means lip or edge. Think about that etymology for a second. The edge of the mouth. The border between inside and outside. The boundary between thought and expression. And the word translated as speech is devarim, which doesn't just mean words, it means things, matters, realities. In ancient Hebrew, the word for a spoken thing and a real thing are practically identical, because in that worldview, to name something was to call it into being. Language wasn't just communication, language was ontological. Language was reality shaping. So when verse 1 says the whole earth was of one language and one speech, it is saying something far more radical than everyone spoke the same tongue. It is saying that humanity once shared a single, unified perception of reality. One way of cutting the world at its joints. One collective map of what was real and what was not. That is a staggering thought, and it is the premise on which this entire terrifying story rests. Then comes verse 2. "And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there." The land of Shinar. This is not metaphor. This is not allegory. Shinar is the ancient Hebrew name for the region the Greeks called Mesopotamia, from the Greek for the land between the rivers, specifically the alluvial plain between the Tigris and the Euphrates, the territory that today encompasses southern Iraq. And the name Shinar itself, in its etymology, carries connotations of shaking, of trembling, of agitation. Even the name of the place vibrates with unease. They came from the east, they found the plain, they stopped. And right there, in that small act of stopping, in that choice to dwell in a particular place, the catastrophe begins its long, slow approach. Because what happens next is not the act of evil people. That is the thing that makes this story so genuinely disturbing. The people who build the tower are not described as wicked. They are not monsters. They are not tyrants, at least not in this telling. They are people who arrived somewhere flat and featureless and overwhelming, and they did what humans have always done when they arrive in a place that makes them feel small. They decided to build something enormous. Verse 3. And they said one to another, "Go to, let us make brick, and burn them throughly." And they had brick for stone, and slime had they for mortar. Notice the unanimity of this. They said one to another. There is no dissenting voice in this moment. There is no minority opinion. No one stands up and says, "Wait, maybe we should think about this." This is collective human will in its purest and most concentrated form. And what is the first thing they decide to make? Not food, not shelter, not a temple for worship, at least not yet. The first thing they make is brick. They innovate. They are in a landscape with no stone. The Mesopotamian plain is essentially stoneless. It is one of the flattest, most geologically uniform surfaces on Earth. And so they do not accept that limitation. They engineer around it. They take the clay of the earth, the stuff that is literally everywhere under their feet, and they transform it. They fire it. They make it hard and regular and stackable. And the word translated here as slime, which is a wonderful, archaic English choice that really loses nothing in translation, is the Hebrew word chemar, which refers specifically to bitumen, to natural asphalt, the black, viscous, petroleum-derived substance that seeps naturally from the ground in this region. They are using industrial-grade petroleum tar as their mortar. Think about how sophisticated this is. Think about how intentional. This is not a story about primitive people throwing mud together. This is a story about technological mastery. This is humanity at the absolute peak of its pre-modern engineering capability. And then comes verse 4. This is the verse that matters. This is the verse that has haunted theologians, philosophers, archaeologists, and psychologists for 3,000 years. And they said, "Go to, let us build us a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth." Read that again, slowly. Lest we be scattered. They are not building the tower out of arrogance alone, though arrogance is certainly present. They are building it out of fear. They are building it as a defense against entropy. They are building it because they understand, somewhere in the reptilian hinge of their collective brain, that dispersion is death. That scattering means the end of everything they are. The tower is not an act of aggression, it is an act of existential terror. It is the architectural embodiment of the most primal human fear, the fear of dissolution, the fear of losing one's people, one's language, one's shared reality. And in that fear, in that very understandable, very human, very recognizable fear, they reach for the one thing that has always made human beings dangerous. They reach for collective will aligned behind a single, enormous project. And God, in this story, responds not with anger, but with something more unsettling: concern. Verse 6, "And the Lord said, Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language, and this they begin to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do." Read that as a statement of fact, not as hyperbole, not as divine paranoia. Read it as a cold, clear-eyed assessment of what unified human capability can achieve. Nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. This is arguably the most frightening sentence in the entire Hebrew Bible, and it is spoken by God Himself as a justification for intervention. The implication is staggering. The implication is that human beings, given unity of language, unity of purpose, and sufficient time and material, are capable of literally anything they can conceive of. God is not saying they are bad, He is saying they are unlimited. And the decision is made to introduce limitation. The intervention is surgical and devastating. "Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. And just like that, the most advanced civilization in the ancient world collapses inward. Not from conquest, not from famine, not from plague, from incomprehension, from the sudden, terrifying inability to understand the person standing right next to you. Part 2. The Alchemy of the Machine. Let's talk about the brick, because the brick is important. The brick is, in many ways, the real protagonist of this story. The technology that made everything possible. The invention that changed the trajectory of civilization in the ancient Near East in ways we still haven't fully reckoned with. When the text says, "Let us make brick and burn them throughly," it is describing what archaeologists call fired or kiln-fired brick, as distinct from the sun-dried mud brick that had been used in the region for millennia before. Sun-dried mud brick is perfectly functional in a dry climate. It is cheap, abundant, and easy to work with. But it has a fatal weakness: water. Rain, flooding, rising groundwater, even sustained humidity will dissolve it back into mud with depressing efficiency. The ancient Mesopotamian plain is crossed by two of the most unpredictable rivers in the world. The Tigris and the Euphrates don't flood on a reliable Egyptian schedule. They flood violently, chaotically, with almost no warning. And their floods are not the gentle, life-giving inundations of the Nile. They are destructive and devastating. Building with sun-dried mud brick in this environment was, over geological time, a losing proposition. You built, the river came, and you rebuilt. This is why Mesopotamian cities have tells, those characteristic mound-shaped archaeological sites, because they are literally composed of layer upon layer of collapsed and rebuilt structures, compressed by centuries into hills. Kiln-fired brick changed this equation. The process was technically demanding and energetically expensive. You needed to source quality clay, mix it to the right consistency, form it into regular shapes, allow it to dry partially to prevent explosive steam buildup during firing, and then subject it to sustained temperatures of around 900 to 1,100 degrees Celsius for long enough to vitrify the material, to essentially turn it into a ceramic. The kilns required for this process were sophisticated structures in their own right, requiring careful management of airflow and temperature gradients. The fuel consumption was enormous, the kind of operation that required a centralized, organized workforce and a reliable supply chain for fuel, likely reeds and bituminous materials, given the scarcity of wood on the Mesopotamian plain. This was not a cottage industry. This was an industrial operation. The scale of kiln-fired brick production, visible in the archaeological record from ancient Babylon, is genuinely astonishing. Hundreds of millions of bricks, many of them stamped with royal inscriptions, produced over centuries and used to construct a city of extraordinary density and ambition. And then there is the bitumen, the slime of the Genesis text, the chemar, the material that held it all together. Natural bitumen seeps occur throughout southern Iraq, where petroleum-bearing strata are close to the surface. The ancient Mesopotamians had been using bitumen for waterproofing, for caulking boats, for adhesive purposes, for thousands of years before the construction of the great ziggurats. They understood its properties intimately. As a mortar, in combination with kiln-fired brick, it created a construction medium of remarkable durability. Unlike lime mortar, which requires precise mixing ratios and curing conditions, bitumen mortar is self-sealing, plastic, and tolerant of slight movements in the structure without cracking. It bonds to the vitrified surface of fired brick with tenacious permanence. There are walls in the ruins of ancient Babylon where the bitumen mortar has outlasted the brick it held together, where the mortar survives intact while the brick has been eroded or removed, creating a kind of ghostly skeleton of the original structure, a negative space defined by adhesive. When you look at photographs of the excavations at Babylon, when you see those dark bands of bitumen running through the crumbling masonry, you are seeing the skeleton of the most ambitious construction project in the ancient world. You are seeing the literal material remains of the Tower of Babel's closest historical cousin. Because here is where we need to be precise about something. The Tower of Babel is a myth, yes, in the technical anthropological sense, a sacred narrative that conveys profound cultural and theological meaning. But it is not pure invention. It is not sprung from nothing. Behind the story, encoded in its specific details, its technological references, its geographical setting, is the memory of something real. The Mesopotamian ziggurat was as real as concrete, as real as steel, as real as any structure that has ever risen above the horizon. And one ziggurat in particular, the Great Temple Tower of Babylon, a structure whose Sumerian name was Etemenanki, which translates as House of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth, matches the Genesis account with a specificity that is not coincidental. Etemenanki was real. It was immense. It was, for a brief window in ancient history, probably the tallest structure that had ever been built by human hands. And it was built with kiln-fired brick. And it was mortared, at least in its lower courses, with bitumen. The Genesis account, read as a compressed memory of actual historical events filtered through centuries of theological interpretation, is describing this structure, or structures like it, or the idea of structures like it, or all three simultaneously, which is what myths do best. The Mesopotamian plain, you have to understand, has a relationship with verticality that is unlike any other major civilizational heartland. In Egypt, you have the cliffs of the Nile Valley, the sandstone escarpments, the limestone plateau of Giza that rises naturally above the floodplain. In Greece, you have mountain after mountain, ridge after ridge, the vertical dimension built into the landscape at every turn. In Mesopotamia, you have almost nothing. The alluvial plain between the two rivers is so flat that on a clear day you can see the curvature of the earth. Geographers describe it as one of the flattest surfaces of comparable area on the planet. This landscape, this radical, almost surreal horizontality, did something to the people who lived in it. It created in them a relationship with the vertical that was essentially theological. High places were sacred places. The mountain was where the gods lived, where heaven intersected with earth, where the cosmic order was maintained and renewed. And in a land with no mountains, you had a choice. You either accepted that your land was beyond the reach of the sacred, that the gods were permanently elsewhere, which was psychologically untenable for any ancient civilization, or you built your own mountain. You erected a connection point. You constructed the axis mundi out of fired clay and tar, out of organized human labor and political will, out of a civilization's collective longing for contact with the vertical. The ziggurat was not merely a building, it was a theological technology. It was humanity's answer to the problem of the flat earth. Part 3. The Vertigo of Etemenanki. Stand in the middle of the Mesopotamian plain today and look south toward where Babylon once stood. The modern Iraqi city of Hilla is there now, low, dusty, spread out in the heat. A few kilometers north, the archaeological site of Babylon occupies a modest area of low mounds, eroded walls, crumbling mud brick structures, the shrunken ghost of a city that was once, by ancient standards, almost incomprehensibly vast. And at the heart of that site, in the area designated by archaeologists as the Inner City, there is a depression, a large, roughly square depression, filled now with stagnant water and reeds, and the particular melancholy of destroyed things. It measures approximately 90 meters on a side. This hole in the ground is all that remains of Etemenanki. This is where the tower stood. And when you stand at the edge of that depression and look down into the muddy water and understand what was once here, you feel something difficult to name. Not quite awe, not quite grief, something more like vertigo, the sudden awareness of a vast height from which something has fallen. What was here, based on the most reliable ancient sources, was a structure of 7 stages, a stepped pyramid rising to a height that ancient texts variously describe as being between 60 and 90 meters, with the most credible reconstruction, based on the proportions described in a tablet known as the Esagila tablet, suggesting a total height of approximately 90 meters, or about 300 feet. To put that in contemporary terms, 90 meters is roughly the height of a 30-story building. In the 21st century, surrounded by glass and steel skyscrapers, 90 meters sounds modest. In the Babylonian plain, circa 600 BCE, with no other structure within 1,000 kilometers even approaching that height, 90 meters was not modest. 90 meters was the vertical expression of the absolute ceiling of human ambition. 90 meters was, to anyone standing on the flat plain watching it materialize on the horizon as they approached, an instrument of pure psychological domination. It announced from 20, 30, 40 kilometers away that something unprecedented was here. That a civilization existed here that was operating at a level of organized power that had no parallel in the world. The structure was not built all at once. That is crucial to understanding it. The great ziggurat of Babylon, the one that would become the prototype for the Tower of Babel in Jewish cultural memory, was the culmination of a building tradition that stretched back at least 2,000 years before its final and most spectacular iteration. The earliest ziggurats appeared in Sumer in the late 4th millennium BCE, roughly 3,500 to 3,000 BCE. They were modest by later standards, multi-staged mud brick platforms that elevated the temple above the surrounding plain, that put the house of the god at a height where it could be seen and where its occupants could see. The theological logic was straightforward and viscerally effective. The god lived at the top, the priest climbed to meet the god, the ordinary citizen watched from below and understood through the physical geometry of the situation exactly what their relationship to the divine was. These early ziggurats were teaching tools. They were spatial arguments about the structure of the cosmos. And they worked. Over the following 2 millennia, the tradition evolved, expanded, became more technically sophisticated and politically freighted. Every major Sumerian and Akkadian city had its ziggurat. Ur, Uruk, Nippur, Eridu, Larsa, Kish. Each of these cities rose and fell and was rebuilt, and at the center of each, the ziggurat was the one structure that was always maintained, always rebuilt when damaged, always present. Because the ziggurat was the city's claim on cosmic legitimacy. It was the physical argument for why this particular city, and not some other, deserved the favor of the gods. It was the original monument, in the strict Latin sense of the word, the monere, the warning, the thing that reminds you. It reminded everyone who could see it that this city was connected to heaven, that the gods had chosen to descend here, to this precise point on the featureless plain, to conduct their business with the human world. The political implications of this were enormous. The city with the biggest, most impressive ziggurat was the city with the most direct divine hotline, was the city whose king could most plausibly claim to be acting on divine instructions. Nebuchadnezzar II understood this perfectly. More than any king before or after him, Nebuchadnezzar grasped the relationship between monumental architecture and political theology. When he rebuilt and expanded Etemenanki in the early 6th century BCE, around 600 BCE, he was not engaged in a purely religious act. He was conducting the most sophisticated propaganda operation the ancient world had ever seen. The inscriptions he left on the bricks of Etemenanki, The cuneiform stamps that marked each individual fired brick with the royal name weren't just bureaucratic record-keeping. They were a statement that this structure, this mountain of clay and tar rising above the flat world, was his. That its connection to heaven was mediated through him. That to look at Etemenanke was to understand who stood between the human and the divine. Every brick in that tower was a vote for Nebuchadnezzar. Every course of masonry was an argument for his legitimacy. The sheer physical accumulation of those bricks, those hundreds of millions of individually stamped, individually fired, individually laid pieces of clay, was the most literal possible expression of royal power. You could count it, you could touch it, you could not argue with it. The approach to Etemenanke from the great processional way, the broad ceremonial avenue that ran through the heart of Babylon, lined with glazed blue brick walls, decorated with lions and dragons in brilliant polychrome relief, was designed as a carefully choreographed experience of escalating awe. You began from a distance, from the outer city, where the tower was already visible on the horizon. As you walked the processional way, under the Ishtar Gate with its magnificent glazed brick imagery, the structure grew before you at a rate that was not quite proportional to your movement, that seemed to accelerate as you got closer, that played tricks with your depth perception and scale intuitions in a way that was almost certainly intentional. By the time you reached the Great Temenos, the sacred enclosure that surrounded the ziggurat space, and looked up at the first stage rising above you, the psychological effect was overwhelming. This was not accidental. This was engineered. This was a civilization that understood the relationship between architecture and the human nervous system, that knew how to use scale and proportion and the experience of approach to produce specific states of mind. Specifically, the state of mind of someone who is very small, standing before something very large, that is associated with something very powerful, and who very much wants the favor of that something. You were, in the shadow of Etemenanke, exactly where Nebuchadnezzar needed you to be. Part 4. The Psychology of Nebuchadnezzar. If you want to understand the Tower of Babel, you have to understand Nebuchadnezzar II. Not the cartoon villain of Christian eschatology, not the madman crawling on all fours eating grass in the book of Daniel, though we will get to that too. The actual historical Nebuchadnezzar II, king of the Neo-Babylonian Empire from approximately 605 to 562 BCE, one of the most militarily successful, administratively capable, and psychologically complex monarchs of the ancient world. A man who ruled for 43 years. A man who defeated the Egyptians at Carchemish, who destroyed Jerusalem and deported its population in one of the most consequential acts of demographic engineering in ancient history, who turned the city of Babylon into something that, by the standards of the ancient world, had no peer, and a man who, by the end of his reign, appears to have experienced some form of catastrophic psychological collapse. The external record of Nebuchadnezzar's building program is staggering in its scope. He did not merely expand or renovate Babylon, he essentially rebuilt it from the ground up, transforming a significant but not exceptional Mesopotamian city into something that contemporaries and subsequent generations described in terms that we would normally reserve for miracles. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing roughly a century after Nebuchadnezzar's death, described Babylon as a city without equal anywhere in the known world, a city of such wealth and complexity and scale that his account reads like fiction, even though modern archaeology has broadly confirmed his basic dimensions. The outer walls of Babylon, as Herodotus describes them, and as excavation has partially confirmed, were wide enough at the top for 2 four-horse chariots to pass each other. The city enclosed an area of approximately 850 hectares. The population at its peak may have been as high as 200,000 people, which, in the context of the ancient world, in the 6th century BCE, made it by far the largest city on Earth. There was nothing else like it. It was a category of one. Nebuchadnezzar's inscriptions, which survive in remarkable abundance because he had the habit of stamping everything he built with his name, not just bricks, but cylinder seals, tablets, architectural elements, anything that could receive a cuneiform impression, speak of his building program in terms that are simultaneously grandiose and defensive. He is constantly, obsessively justifying himself. He is constantly returning to the theme of divine mandate. The gods told me to do this. The gods wanted this. I am merely the instrument of divine will. There is something in the sheer repetitiveness of this justification that reads, to a modern psychological eye, less like genuine religious conviction and more like the kind of compulsive self-reassurance of someone who is not entirely sure they deserve what they have. The inscriptions of a genuinely secure ruler don't need to justify themselves this much. The inscriptions of Nebuchadnezzar read like the internal monologue of a man who is simultaneously at the peak of his power and terrified of something he cannot quite name. And there is one inscription in particular, discovered by archaeologists in the 19th century, and now known as the East India House inscription, which describes his rebuilding of Etemenanki in terms so hyperbolic, so clearly reaching for a language adequate to express something the available vocabulary couldn't quite contain, that scholars have debated its meaning for generations. In this inscription, Nebuchadnezzar describes being commanded by the god Marduk to restore the ziggurat to its ancient glory, to raise its top to compete with heaven itself, to make it a rival of the sky. And he describes the materials gathered for this purpose in a way that reads like a catalogue of everything that was precious and powerful in the ancient world. Cedar from Lebanon, gold from distant mountains, precious stones, bitumen from the Tigris banks, fired brick of the highest quality. The entire empire, as he describes it, was essentially a machine for producing the materials needed for this structure. Every province had its quota. Every subject people had their assigned contribution. The tower was not just Nebuchadnezzar's ambition made physical. It was the entire Neo-Babylonian Empire concentrated into a single vertical point. But here is the thing about Nebuchadnezzar that the ancient sources, both Babylonian and biblical, converge on with uncomfortable clarity. He lost his mind. The Book of Daniel, which is notoriously difficult to date and whose historical reliability is disputed, contains a narrative of Nebuchadnezzar's descent into a condition the text calls boanthropy, the delusion that one is a bovine, in which the great king is described as being driven from human society, living in the fields, eating grass like cattle, his hair growing like eagle's feathers, his nails like birds' claws, for a period of 7 years. Scholars have proposed various diagnoses for whatever historical reality may lie behind this account: clinical lycanthropy, porphyria, extreme isolation, a form of reactive psychosis triggered by the specific